Chapter 12.
Part 1 of The Italian. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Italian by Ann Radcliffe. Read by Gary Day.
Chapter 12.
Part 1. That lawn conceals her beauty, as the thin cloud just silvered by the rays, the trembling moon. Think ye 'tis shrouded from the curious eye? Wrapped in Olivia's veil, Helena descended to the music room, and mingled with the nuns who were assembled within the grate. Among the monks and pilgrims without it were some strangers in the usual dress of the country; but she did not perceive any person who resembled Vivaldi, and she considered that, if he were present, he would not venture to discover himself, while her nun's veil concealed her as effectually from him as from the lady abbess. It would be necessary, therefore, to seek an opportunity of withdrawing it for a moment at the grate, an expedient which must certainly expose her to the notice of strangers. On the entrance of the lady abbess, Helena's fear of observation rendered her insensible to every other consideration. She fancied that the eyes of the superior were particularly directed upon herself. The veil seemed an insufficient protection from their penetrating glances, and she almost sunk with the terror of instant discovery. The abbess, however, passed on, and having conversed for a few moments with the Padre Abate and some visitors of distinction, took her chair, and the performance immediately opened with one of those solemn and impressive airs which the Italian nuns know how to give with so much taste and sweetness. It rescued even Helena for a moment from a sense of danger, and she resigned herself to the surrounding scene, of which the coup d'oeil was striking and grand. In a vaulted apartment of considerable extent, lighted by innumerable tapers, and where even the ornaments, though pompous, partook of the solemn character of the institution, were assembled about 50 nuns, who, in the interesting habit of their order, appeared with graceful plainness. The delicacy of their air and their beauty, softened by the lawn that thinly veiled it, were contrasted by the severe majesty of the lady abbess, who, seated on an elevated chair apart from the audience, seemed the empress of the scene, and by the venerable figures of the Father Abate and his attendant monks, who were arranged without that screen of wirework, extending the whole breadth of the apartment which is called the grate. Near the Holy Father were placed the strangers of distinction, dressed in the splendid Neapolitan habit, whose gay colouring and airy elegance opposed well with the dark drapery of the ecclesiastics, their plumed hats lostily overtopping the half-cowled heads and grey locks of the monks. Nor was the contrast of countenance less striking. The grave, the austere, the solemn, and the gloomy, intermingling with the light, the blooming, and the debonair, expressed all the various tempers that render life a blessing or a burden, and, as with the spell of magic, transform this world into a transient paradise or purgatory. In the background of the picture stood some pilgrims, with looks less joyous and more demure than they had worn on the road the preceding day, and among them were some inferior brothers and attendants of the convent. To this part of the chamber Helena frequently directed her attention, but she did not distinguish Vivaldi, and though she had taken a station near the grate, she had not courage indecorously to withdraw her veil before so many strangers, and thus, even if he were in the apartment, it was not probable that he would venture to come forward. The concert concluded without his having been discovered by Helena, and she withdrew to the apartment where the collation was spread, and where the abbess and her guests soon after appeared. Presently she observed a stranger in a pilgrim's habit station himself near the grate. His face was partly muffled by his cloak, and he seemed to be a spectator rather than the partaker of the feast. Helena, who understood this to be Vivaldi, was watchful for an opportunity of approaching, unseen by the abbess, the place where he had fixed himself. Engaged in conversation with the ladies around her, the superior soon favoured Elena's wish, who, having reached the grate, ventured to lift her veil for one instant. The stranger, letting his cloak fall, thanked her with his eyes for her condescension, and she perceived that he was not Vivaldi. Shocked at the interpretation which might be given to a conduct apparently so improper, as much as by the disappointment which Vivaldi's absence occasioned, she was hastily retiring, when another stranger approached with quick steps, whom she instantly knew, by the grace and spirit of his air, to be Vivaldi. But, determined not to expose herself a second time to the possibility of a mistake, she awaited for some further signal of his identity before she discovered herself. His eyes were fixed upon her in earnest attention for some moments, before he drew aside the cloak from his face; but he soon did so, and it was Vivaldi himself. Elena, perceiving that she was known, did not raise her veil, but advanced a few steps towards the grate. Vivaldi there deposited a small folded paper, and before she could venture to deliver her own billet, he had retired among the crowd. As she stepped forward to secure his letter, she observed a nun hastily approach the spot where he had laid it, and she paused. The garment of the reluctant wasted it from the place where it had been partly concealed, and when Elena perceived the nun's foot rest upon the paper, she with difficulty disguised her apprehensions. A friar who, from without the grate, addressed the sister, seemed with much earnestness, yet with a certain air of secrecy, communicating some important intelligence. The fears of Elena suggested that he had observed the action of Vivaldi, and was making known his suspicions, and she expected every instant to see the nun lift up the paper and deliver it to the abbess. From this immediate apprehension, however, she was released when the sister pushed it gently aside without examination, a circumstance that not less surprised than relieved her. But when the conference broke up, and the friar, hastily retreating from the crowd, disappeared from the apartment, and the nun approached and whispered the superior, all her terrors were renewed. She scarcely doubted that Vivaldi was detected, and that his letter was designedly left where it had been deposited, for the purposes of alluring her to betray herself. Trembling, dismayed, and almost sinking with apprehension, she watched the countenance of the abbess while the nun addressed her, and thought she read her own fate in the frown that appeared there. Whatever might be the intentions or the directions of the superior, no active measure was at present employed. The recluse, having received an answer, retired quietly among the sisters, and the abbess resumed her usual manner. Elena, however, supposing she was now observed, did not dare to seize the paper, though she believed it contained momentous information, and feared that the time was now escaping which might facilitate her deliverance. Whenever she ventured to look around, the eyes of the abbess seemed pointed upon her, and she judged from the position of the nun, for the veil concealed her face, that she was also vigilantly regarding her. Above an hour had elapsed in this state of anxious suspense, when the collation concluded and the assembly broke up, during the general bustle of which Elena ventured to the grate and secured the paper. As she concealed it in her robe, she scarcely dared to inquire by a hasty glance whether she had been observed, and would have withdrawn immediately to examine the contents, had she not perceived at the same instant the abbess quitting the apartment. On looking round for the nun, Elena discovered that she was gone. Elena followed distantly in the abbess's train, and as she drew nearer to Olivia gave a signal, and passed on to her cell. There, once more alone, and having secured the door, she sat down to read Vivaldi's billet, trying to command her impatience, and to understand the lines over which her sight rapidly moved, when, in the eagerness of turning over the paper, the lamp dropped from her trembling hand and expired. Her distress now nearly reached despair. To go forth into the convent for a light was utterly impracticable, since it would betray that she was no longer a prisoner. and not only would Olivia suffer from a discovery of the indulgence she had granted, but she herself would be immediately confined. Her only hope rested upon Olivia's arrival before it might be too late to practise the instructions of Vivaldi, if indeed they were still practicable; and she listened with intense solicitude for an approaching footstep, while she yet held, ignorant of its contents, the billet that probably would decide her fate. 1,000 times she turned about the eventful paper, endeavoured to trace the lines with her fingers, and to guess their import, thus enveloped in mystery, while she experienced all the various torture that the consciousness of having in her very hand the information, on a timely knowledge of which her life perhaps depended, without being able to understand it, could inflict. Presently she heard advancing steps, and a light gleamed from the passage before she considered they might be some other than Olivia's, and that it was prudent to conceal the billet she held. The consideration, however, came too late to be acted upon, for, before the rustling paper was disposed of, a person entered the cell, and Helena beheld her friend. Pale, trembling, and silent, she took the lamp from the nun, and, eagerly running over Vivaldi's note, learned that at the time it was written, Brother Geronimo was in waiting without the gate of the nuns' garden, where Vivaldi designed to join him immediately, and conduct her by a private way beyond the walls. He added that horses were stationed at the foot of the mountain, to convey her wherever she should judge proper, and conjured her to be expeditious, since other circumstances beside the universal engagement of the recluses were at that moment particularly favourable to an escape. Helena, desponding and appalled, gave the paper to Olivier, requesting that she would read it hastily and advise her how to act. It was an hour and a half since Vivaldi had said that success depended upon expedition, and that he had probably watched at the appointed place. In such an interval, how many circumstances might have occurred to destroy every possibility of a retreat, which it was certain the engagement of the abbess and the sisters no longer favoured. The generous Olivier, having read the billet, partook of all her young friend's distress, and was as willing as Helena was anxious to dare every danger for the chance of obtaining deliverance. Helena could feel gratitude for such goodness even at this moment of agonizing apprehension. After a pause of deep consideration, Olivia said: "In every avenue of the convent we are now liable to meet some of the nuns; but my veil, though thin, has hitherto protected you, and we must hope it may still assist your purpose. It will be necessary, however, to pass through the refectory, where such of the sisters as did not partake of the collation are assembled at supper, and will remain so till the first matin calls them to the chapel. If we wait till then, I fear it will be to no purpose to go at all." Helena's fears perfectly agreed with those of Olivia, and entreating that another moment might not be lost in hesitation, and that she would lead the way to the nuns' garden, they quitted the cell together. Several of the sisters passed them as they descended to the refectory, but without particularly noticing Helena, who, as she drew near that alarming apartment, wrapped her veil closer, and leaned with heavier pressure upon the arm of her faithful friend. At the door they were met by the abbess, who had been overlooking the nuns assembled at supper, and, missing Olivia, had inquired for her. Helena shrunk back to elude observation, and to let the superior pass; but Olivia was obliged to answer to the summons. Having, however, unveiled herself, she was permitted to proceed; and Helena, who had mingled with the crowd that surrounded the abbess, and thus escaped detection, followed Olivia with faltering steps through the refectory. The nuns were luckily too much engaged by the entertainment at this moment to look around, and the fugitive reached, unsuspected, an opposite door. In the hall to which they descended, the adventurers were frequently crossed by servants bearing dishes from the refectory to the kitchen, and at the very moment when they were opening the door that led into the garden, a sister, who had observed them, demanded whether they had yet heard the matin bell, since they were going towards the chapel. Terrified at this critical interruption, Helena pressed Olivia's arm, in signal of silence, and was hastening forward, when the latter, more prudent, paused, and calmly answering the question, was then suffered to proceed. As they crossed the garden towards the gate, Helena's anxiety lest Vivaldi should have been compelled to leave it increased so much that she had scarcely power to proceed. "Oh, if my strength should fail before I reach it!" she said softly to Olivier, "or if I should reach it too late." Olivier tried to cheer her, and pointed out the gate, on which the moonlight fell. "At the end of this walk only," said Olivier. "See, where the shadows of the trees open, is our goal." Encouraged by the view of it, Helena fled with lighter steps along the alley; but the gate seemed to mock her approach, and to retreat before her. Fatigue overtook her in this long alley, before she could overtake the spot so anxiously fought; and, breathless and exhausted, she was once more compelled to stop, and once more, in the agony of terror, exclaimed, "Oh, if my strength should fail before I reach it! Oh, if I should drop even while it is in my view!" The pause of a moment enabled her to proceed, and she stopped not again till she arrived at the gate, when Olivier suggested the prudence of ascertaining who was without, and of receiving an answer to the signal which Vivaldi had proposed, before they ventured to make themselves known. She then struck upon the wood, and in an anxious pause that followed, whispering voices were distinctly heard from without, but no signal spoke in reply to the nuns. "We are betrayed," said Helena softly; "but I will know the worst at once." And she repeated the signal, when, to her unspeakable joy, it was answered by 3 smart raps upon the gate. Olivia, more distrustful, would have checked the sudden hope of her friend, till some further proof had appeared that it was Vivaldi who waited without; but her precaution came too late. A key was already grated in the lock. The door opened, and 2 persons, muffled in their garments, appeared at it. Helena was hastily retreating, when a well-known voice recalled her, and she perceived by the rays of a half-hooded lamp which Geronimo held, Vivaldi. "Oh, heavens!" he exclaimed, in a voice tremulous with joy, as he took her hand. "Is it possible that you are again my own? If you could but know what I have suffered during this last hour!" Then, observing Olivier, he drew back, till Helena expressed her deep sense of obligation to the nun. "We have no time to lose," said Geronimo sullenly. "We have stayed too long already, as you will find, perhaps." "Farewell, dear Helena," said Olivia. "May the protection of heaven never leave you." The fears of Helena now gave way to affectionate sorrow, as, weeping on the bosom of the nun, she said, "Farewell, oh, farewell, my dear, my tender friend! I must never, never see you more; but I shall always love you, and you have promised that I shall hear from you. Remember the convent della Pieta." "You should have settled this matter within," said Geronimo. "We have been here these 2 hours already." "Ah, Helena," said Vivaldi, as he gently disengaged her from the nun, "do I then hold only the second place in your heart?" Helena, as she dismissed her tears, replied with a smile more eloquent than words; and when she had again and again bade adieu to Olivia, she gave him her hand and quitted the gate. "It is moonlight," observed Vivaldi to Geronimo. "Your lamp is useless, and may betray us." "It will be necessary in the church," replied Geronimo, "and in some circuitous avenues we must pass; for I dare not lead you out through the great gate, Signor, as you well know." "Lead on, then," replied Vivaldi; and they reached one of the cypress walks that extended to the church. But before they entered it, Helena paused and looked back to the garden gate, that she might see Olivia once again. The nun was still there, and Helena perceived her faintly in the moonlight, waving her hand in signal of a last adieu. Helena's heart was full. She wept and lingered, and returned the signal, till the gentle violence of Vivaldi withdrew her from the spot. "I envy your friend those tears," said he, "and I feel jealous of the tenderness that excites them. Weep no more, my Helena." "If you knew her worth," replied Helena, "and the obligations I owe her." Her voice was lost in sighs, and Vivaldi only pressed her hand in silence. As they traversed the gloomy walk that led to the church, Vivaldi said, "Are you certain, father, that not any of the brothers are doing penance in the shrines in our way?" "Doing penance on a festival, signor? They are more likely by this time to be taking down the ornaments." "That would be equally unfortunate for us," said Vivaldi. "Cannot we avoid the church, father?" Geronimo assured him that this was impossible, and they immediately entered one of its lonely aisles, where he unhooded the lamp, for the tapers which had given splendour at an earlier hour to the numerous shrines had expired, except those at the high altar, which were so remote that their rays faded into twilight long before they reached the part of the church where the fugitives passed. Here and there, indeed, a dying lamp shot a tremulous gleam upon the shrine below, and vanished again, serving to mark the distances in the long perspective of arches, rather than to enlighten the gloomy solitude. But no sound, not even of a whisper, stole along the pavement. They crossed to a side door communicating with the court, and with the rock which enshrined the image of Our Lady of Mount Carmel. There the sudden glare of tapers issuing from the cave alarmed the fugitives, who had begun to retreat, when Geronimo, stepping forward to examine the place, assured them that there was no symptom of any person being within, and that lights burned day and night around the shrine. Revived by this explanation, they followed into the cave, where their conductor opened a part of the wirework enclosing the saint, and led them to the extremity of the vault, sunk deep within which appeared a small door. While Elena trembled with apprehension, Geronimo applied a key, and they perceived beyond the door a narrow passage winding away into the rock. The monk was leading on, but Vivaldi, who had the suspicions of Elena, paused at the entrance, and demanded whither he was conducting them. "To the place of your destination," replied the brother in a hollow voice, an answer which alarmed Elena and did not satisfy Vivaldi. "I have given myself to your guidance," he said, "and have confided to you what is dearer to me than existence. Your life," pointing to the short sword concealed beneath his pilgrim's vest. "Your life may rely upon my word, shall answer for your treachery. If this purpose is evil, pause a moment and repent, or you shall not quit this passage alive." "Do you menace me?" replied the brother, his countenance darkening. "Of what service would be my death to you? Do you not know that every brother in the convent would rise to avenge it?" "I know only that I will make sure of one traitor, if there be one," said Vivaldi, "and defend this lady against your host of monks. And, since you also know this, proceed accordingly." At this instant, it occurring to Elena that the passage in question probably led to the prison chamber, which Olivia had described as situated within some deep recess of the convent, and that Geronimo had certainly betrayed them, she refused to go further. "If your purpose is honest," said she, "why do you not conduct us through some direct gate of the convent? Why are we brought into these subterraneous labyrinths?" "There is no direct gate but that of the portal," Geronimo replied, "and this is the only other avenue leading beyond the walls." "And why can we not go out through the portal?" Vivaldi asked. "Because it is beset with pilgrims and lay brothers," replied Geronimo; "and though you might pass them safely enough, what is to become of the lady? But all this you knew before, Senor, and was willing enough to trust me then. The passage we are entering opens upon the cliffs at some distance. I have run hazard enough already, and I will waste no more time. So if you do not choose to go forward, I will leave you, and you may act as you please." He concluded with a laugh of derision, and was relocking the door, when Vivaldi, alarmed for the probable consequence of his resentment, and somewhat reassured by the indifference he discovered as to their pursuing the avenue or not, endeavoured to appease him, as well as to encourage Elena, and he succeeded in both. As he followed in silence through the gloomy passage, his doubts were, however, not so wholly vanquished, but that he prepared for attack, and while he supported Elena with one hand, he held his sword in the other. The avenue was of considerable length, and before they reached its extremity, they heard music from a distance winding along the rocks. "Hark!" cried Helena. "Whence come those sounds? Listen!" "From the cave we have left," replied Geronimo. "And it is midnight by that. It is the last chant of the pilgrims at the shrine of Our Lady. Make haste, Signor. I shall be called for." The fugitives now perceived that all retreat was cut off, and that if they had lingered only a few moments longer in the cave, then they should have been surprised by those devotees, one of whom, however, it appeared possible might wander into this avenue, and still interrupt their escape. When Vivaldi had told his apprehensions, Geronimo, with an arch sneer, affirmed there was no danger of that. "For the passage," he added, "is known only to the brothers of the convent." Vivaldi's doubts vanished when he further understood that the avenue led only from the cliffs without to the cave, and was used for the purpose of conveying secretly to the shrine such articles as were judged necessary to excite the superstitious wonders of the devotees. While he proceeded in thoughtful silence, a distant chime sounded hollowly through the chambers of the rock. "The matin bell strikes," said Geronimo, in seeming alarm. "I am summoned. Signora, quicken your steps." An unnecessary request, for Helena already passed with her utmost speed, and she now rejoiced on perceiving a door in the remote winding of the passage, which she believed would emancipate her from the convent. But, as she advanced, the avenue appeared extending beyond it, and the door, which stood a little open, allowed her a glimpse of a chamber in the cliff, duskily lighted. Vivaldi, alarmed by the light, inquired, when he had passed, whether any person was in the chamber, and received an equivocal answer from Geronimo, who, however, soon after pointed to an arched gate that terminated the avenue. They proceeded with lighter steps, for hope now cheered their hearts, and on reaching the gate all apprehension vanished. Geronimo gave the lamp to Vivaldi, while he began to unbar and unlock the door, and Vivaldi had prepared to reward the brother for his fidelity, before they perceived that the door refused to yield. A dreadful imagination seized on Vivaldi. Geronimo, turning round, coolly said, "I fear we are betrayed. The second lock is shot. I have only the key of the first." "We are betrayed," said Vivaldi in a resolute tone; "but do not suppose that your dissimulation conceals you. I understand by whom we are betrayed. Recollect my late assertion, and consider once more whether it is your interest to intercept us." End of
Chapter 12.
Part 1.
Part 2 of Chapter 12 of The Italian. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Marty Chris. The Italian by Ann Radcliffe. Chapter 12, Part 2. My signor, replied Geronimo, I do not deceive you when I protest by our holy saint that I have not caused this gate to be fastened, and that I would open it if I could. The lock which holds it was not shot an hour ago. I am the more surprised at what has happened, because this place is seldom passed, even by the holiest footstep. Whoever has passed now has been led hither by suspicion, and comes to intercept your flight. Your wily explanation, brother, may serve you for an inferior occasion, but not on this, replied Vivaldi. Either therefore unclose the gate, or prepare for the worst. You are not now to learn that however flightly I may estimate my own life, I will never abandon this lady to the horrors which your community have already prepared for her. Elena, summoning her fleeting spirits, endeavored to calm the indignation of Vivaldi, and to prevent the consequence of his suspicions, as well as to prevail with Geronimo to unfasten the gate. Her efforts were, however, followed by a long alteration, but at length the art or the innocence of the brother appeased Vivaldi, who now endeavored to force the gate, while Geronimo in vain represented its strength, and the certain ruin that must fall upon himself if it should be discovered he had concurred in destroying it. The gate was immovable, but as no other chance of escaping appeared, Vivaldi was not easily prevailed with to desist. All possibility of retreating too was gone, since the church and the cave were now crowded with devotees attending the matin service. Geronimo, however, seemingly did not despair of effecting their release, but he acknowledged that they would probably be compelled to remain concealed in this gloomy avenue all night, and perhaps the next day. At length it was agreed that he should return to the church, to examine whether a possibility remained of the fugitives passing unobserved to the great portal. And having conducted them back to the chamber of which they had taken a passing glimpse, he proceeded to the shrine. For a considerable time after his departure they were not without hope, but their confidence diminishing as his delay increased, their uncertainty at length became terrible, and it was only for the sake of Vivaldi, from whom she scrupulously concealed all knowledge of the particular fate which she was aware must await her in the convent, that Elena appeared to endure it with calmness. Notwithstanding the plausibility of Geronimo, suspicion of his treachery returned upon her mind. The cold and earthy air of this chamber was like that of a sepulchre, and when she looked round, it appeared exactly to correspond with the description given by Olivia of the prison where the nun had languished and expired. It was walled and vaulted with the rock, had only one small grated aperture in the roof to admit air, and contained no furniture except one table, a bench, and the lamp, which dimly shewed the apartment. That a lamp should be found burning in a place so remote and solitary amazed her still more when she recollected the assertion of Geronimo, that even holy steps seldom passed this way, and when she considered also that he had expressed no surprise at a circumstance, according to his own assertion, so unusual. Again it appeared that she had been betrayed into the very prison designed for her by the abbess, and the horror occasioned by this supposition was so great that she was on the point of disclosing it to Vivaldi, but an apprehension of the distraction into which his desperate courage might precipitate him restrained her. While these considerations occupied Elena, and it appeared that any certainty would be less painful than this suspense, she frequently looked round the chamber in search of some object which might contradict or confirm her suspicion that this was the death room of the unfortunate nun. No such circumstance appeared, but as her eyes glanced with almost frenzied eagerness, she perceived something shadowy in a remote corner of the floor, and on approaching, discovered what seemed a dreadful hieroglyphic, a mattress of straw, in which she thought she beheld the deathbed of the miserable recluse; nay more, that the impression it still retained was that which her form had left there. While Vivaldi was yet entreating her to explain the occasion of the horror she betrayed, the attention of each was withdrawn by a hollow sigh that rose near them. Elena caught unconsciously the arm of Vivaldi and listened, aghast for a return of the sound, but all remained still. "It surely was not fancied," said Vivaldi after a long pause. "You heard it also?" "I did," replied Elena. "It was a sigh, was it not?" he added. "Oh yes, and such a sigh!" "Some person is concealed near us," observed Vivaldi, looking round. "But be not alarmed, Elena. I have a sword." "A sword! Alas, you know not. But hark, there again!" "That was very near us," said Vivaldi. "This lamp burns so sickly," and he held it high, endeavoring to penetrate the furthest gloom of the chamber. "Ha! Who goes there?" he cried, and stepped suddenly forward. But no person appeared, and a silence as of the tomb returned. "If you are in sorrow, speak," Vivaldi at length said. "From fellow sufferers you will meet with sympathy. If your designs are evil, tremble, for you shall find I am desperate." Still no answer was returned, and he carried forward the lamp to the opposite end of the chamber, where he perceived a small door in the rock. At the same instant he heard from within a low tremulous sound as of a person in prayer or in agony. He pressed against the door, which, to his surprise, yielded immediately, and discovered a figure kneeling before a crucifix, with an intention so wholly engaged as not to observe the presence of a stranger till Vivaldi spoke. The person then rose from his knees, and turning, shewed the silvered temples and pale features of an aged monk. The mild and sorrowful character of the countenance, and the lambent lustre of eyes, which seemed still to retain somewhat of the fire of genius, interested Vivaldi and encouraged Elena, who had followed him. An unaffected surprise appeared in the air of the monk, but Vivaldi, notwithstanding the interesting benignity of his countenance, feared to answer his inquiries, till the father hinted to him that an explanation was necessary, even to his own safety. Encouraged by his manner rather than intimidated by this hint, and perceiving that his situation was desperate, Vivaldi confided to the friar some partial knowledge of his embarrassment. While he spoke, the father listened with deep attention, looked with compassion alternately upon him and Elena, and some harassing objection seemed to contend with the pity which urged him to assist the strangers. He inquired how long Geronimo had been absent, and shook his head significantly when he learned that the gate of the avenue was fastened by a double lock. "You are betrayed, my children," said he. "You have trusted with the simplicity of youth, and the cunning of age has deceived you." The terrible conviction affected Elena to tears, and Vivaldi, scarcely able to command the indignation which a view of such treachery excited, was unable to offer her any consolation. "You, my daughter, I remember to have seen in the church this morning," observed the friar. "I remember, too, that you protested against the vows you were brought thither to seal. Alas, my child, was you aware of the consequence of such a proceeding?" "I had only a choice of evils," Elena replied. "Holy Father," said Vivaldi, "I will not believe that you are one of those who either assisted in or approved of the persecution of innocents. If you were acquainted with the misfortunes of this lady, you would pity and save her. But there is now no time for detail, and I can only conjure you, by every sacred consideration, to assist her to leave the convent. If there were leisure to inform you of the unjustifiable means which have been employed to bring her within these walls, if you knew that she was taken an orphan from her home at midnight, that armed ruffians brought her hither, and at the command of strangers, that she has not a single relation surviving to assert her right of independence, or reclaim her of her persecutors. O Holy Father, if you knew all this—" Vivaldi was unable to proceed. The friar again regarded Elena with compassion, but still in thoughtful silence.
"All this may be very true," at length he said, "but—"
and he hesitated. "I understand you, father," said Vivaldi. "You require proof, but how can proof be adduced here? You must rely upon the honor of my word, and if you are inclined to assist us, it must be immediately. While you hesitate, we are lost. Even now I think I hear the footsteps of Geronimo." He stepped softly to the door of the chamber, but all was yet still. The friar, too, listened, but he also deliberated, while Elena, with clasped hands and a look of eager supplication and terror, awaited his decision. "No one is approaching," said Vivaldi. "It is not yet too late. Good father, if you would serve us, dispatch."
"Poor innocent," said the friar, half to himself. "In this chamber, in this fatal place."
"In this chamber!" exclaimed Elena, anticipating his meaning. "It was in this chamber, then, that a nun was suffered to perish, and I no doubt am conducted hither to undergo a similar fate." "In this chamber!" re-echoed Vivaldi in a voice of desperation. "Holy father, if you are indeed disposed to assist us, let us act this instant. The next, perhaps, may render your best intentions unavailing." The friar, who had regarded Elena while she mentioned the nun with his utmost surprise, now withdrew his attention. A few tears fell on his cheek, but he hastily dried them, and seemed struggling to overcome some grief that was deep in his heart. Vivaldi, finding that entreaty had no power to hasten his decision, and expecting every moment to hear the approach of Geronimo, paced the chamber in agonizing perturbation, now pausing at the door to listen, and then calling, though almost hopelessly, upon the humanity of the friar. While Elena, looking round the room in shuddering horror, repeatedly exclaimed, "On this very spot, in this very chamber! Oh, what sufferings have these walls witnessed! What are they yet to witness?" Vivaldi now endeavored to soothe the spirits of Elena, and again urged the friar to employ this critical moment in saving her. "Oh, heaven!" said he, "if she is now discovered, her fate is certain."
"I dare not say what that fate would be," interrupted the father, "or what my own, should I consent to assist you. But though I am old, I have not quite forgotten to feel for others. They may oppress the few remaining years of my age, but the blooming days of youth should flourish, and they shall flourish, my children, if my power can aid you. Follow me to the gate. We will see whether my key cannot unfasten all the locks that hold it." Vivaldi and Elena immediately followed the feeble steps of the old man, who frequently stopped to listen whether Geronimo, or any of the brothers to whom the latter might have betrayed Elena's situation, were approaching. But not an echo wandered along the lonely avenue till they reached the gate, when distant footsteps beat upon the ground. "They are approaching, father," whispered Elena. "Oh, if the key should not open these locks instantly, we are lost. Hark! Now I hear their voices. They call upon my name. Already they have discovered we have left the chamber." While the friar, with trembling hands, applied the key, Vivaldi endeavored at once to assist him, and to encourage Elena. The locks gave way, and the gate opened at once upon the moonlight mountains. Elena heard once more, with the joy of liberty, the midnight breeze passing among the pensile branches of the palms that loftily overshadowed a rude platform before the gate, and rustling with fainter sound among the pendant shrubs of the surrounding cliffs. "There is no leisure for thanks, my children," said the friar, observing they were about to speak. "I will fasten the gate, and endeavor to delay your pursuers, that you may have time to escape. My blessing go with you."
Elena and Vivaldi had scarcely a moment to bid him farewell before he closed the door, and Vivaldi, taking her arm, was hastening towards the place where he had ordered Paolo to wait with the horses, when, on turning an angle of the convent wall, they perceived a long train of pilgrims issuing forth from the portal at a little distance. Vivaldi drew back, yet dreading every moment that he lingered near the monastery to hear the voice of Geronimo or other persons from the avenue, he was sometimes inclined to proceed at any hazard. The only practicable path leading to the base of the mountain, however, was now occupied by these devotees, and to mingle with them was little less than certain destruction. A bright moonlight shewed distinctly every figure that moved in the scene, and the fugitives kept within the shadow of the walls, till, warned by an approaching footstep, they crossed to the feet of the cliffs that rose beyond some palmy hillocks on the right, whose dusky recesses promised a temporary shelter. As they passed with silent steps along the winding rocks, the tranquillity of the landscape below afforded an affecting contrast to the tumult and alarm of their minds. Being now at some distance from the monastery, they rested under the shade of the cliffs, till the procession of devotees which were traced descending among the thicket and hollows of the mountain should be sufficiently remote. Often they looked back to the convent, expecting to see lights issue from the avenue or the portal, and attended in mute anxiety for the sullen murmurs of pursuit, but none came on the breeze, nor did any gleaming lamp betray the steps of a spy. Released at length from immediate apprehension, Helena listened to the matin hymn of the pilgrims as it came upon the still air and ascended towards the cloudless heavens. Not a sound mingled with the holy strain, and even in the measured pause of voices only the trembling of the foliage above was distinguished. The responses, as they softened away in distance and swelled again on the wasting breeze, appeared like the music of spirits watching by night upon the summits of the mountains, and answering each other in celestial airs as they walked their high boundary and overlooked the sleeping world. "How often, Helena, at this hour," said Vivaldi, "have I lingered round your dwelling, consoled by the consciousness of being near you. Within those walls, I have said, she reposes. They enclose my world. All without to me is a desert. Now I am in your presence. O Helena, now that you are once more restored to me, suffer not the caprice of possibility again to separate us. Let me lead you to the first altar that will confirm our vows." Vivaldi forgot, in the anxiety of a stronger interest, the delicate silence he had resolved to impose upon himself till Helena should be in a place of safety. "This is not a moment," she replied, with hesitation. "For conversation our situation is yet perilous. We tremble on the very brink of danger." Vivaldi immediately rose. "Into what imminent danger," said he, "had my selfish folly nearly precipitated you? We are lingering in this alarming neighborhood when that feeble strain indicates the pilgrims to be sufficiently remote to permit us to proceed." As he spoke, they descended cautiously among the cliffs, often looking back to the convent, where, however, no light appeared except what the moon shed over the spires and tall windows of its cathedral. For a moment Helena fancied she saw a taper in her favorite turret, and a belief that the nuns, perhaps the abbess herself, were searching for her there, renewed her terror and her speed. But the rays were only those of the moon striking through the opposite casements of the chamber, and the fugitives reached the base of the mountains without further alarm, where Paolo appeared with horses. "Ah, signoro mio," said the servant, "I am glad to see you alive and merry. I began to fear, by the length of your stay, that the monks had clapped you up to do penance for life. How glad I am to see you, maestro!" "Not more so than I am to see you, good Paolo. But where is the pilgrim's cloak I bade you provide?" Paolo displayed it, and Vivaldi having wrapped it round Helena and placed her on horseback, they took the road towards Naples, Helena designing to take refuge in the Convent della Pieta. Vivaldi, however, apprehending that their enemies would seek them on this road, proposed leaving it as soon as practicable, and reaching the neighborhood of Villa Altieri by a circuitous way. They soon arrived at the tremendous pass through which Helena had approached the monastery, and whose horrors were considerably heightened at this dusky hour, for the moonlight fell only partially upon the deep barriers of the gorge, and frequently the precipice, with the road on its brow, was entirely shadowed by other cliffs and woody points that rose above it. But Paolo, whose spirit seldom owned the influence of local scenery, jogged merrily along, frequently congratulating himself and his master on their escape, and caroling briskly to the echoes of the rocks, till Vivaldi, apprehensive for the consequence of this loud gaiety, desired him to desist.
"Ah, Signoro mio, I must obey," said he, "but my heart was never so full in my life, and I would fain sing to unburden it of some of this joy. That scrape we got into in the dungeon there at what's the name of the place? Was bad enough, but it was nothing to this, because here I was left out of it, and you, maestro, might have been murdered again and again, while I, thinking of nothing at all, was quietly airing myself on the mountain by the moonlight. But what is that yonder in the sky, senor? It looks for all the world like a bridge, only it is perched so high that nobody would think of building one in such an out-of-the-way place unless to cross from cloud to cloud, much less take the trouble of clambering up after it, for the pleasure of going over."
Vivaldi looked forward, and Elena perceived the Alpine bridge she had formerly crossed with so much alarm in the moonlight perspective, airily suspended between the tremendous cliffs, with the river far below tumbling down the rocky chasm. One of the supporting cliffs, with part of the bridge, was in deep shade, but the other feathered with foliage, and the rising surges at its foot were strongly illumined, and many a thicket wet with the spray sparkled in contrast to the dark rock it overhung. Beyond the arch the long-drawn prospect faded into misty light.
"Well, to be sure," exclaimed Paolo, "to see what curiosity will do, if there are not some people have found their way up to the bridge already."
Vivaldi now perceived figures upon the slender arch, and as their indistinct forms glided in the moonshine, other emotions than those of wonder disturbed him, lest these might be pilgrims going to the shrine of Our Lady, and who would give information of his route. No possibility, however, appeared of avoiding them, for the precipices that rose immediately above and fell below forbade all excursion, and the road itself was so narrow as scarcely to admit of two horses passing each other.
"They're all off the bridge now, and without having broken their necks, perhaps," said Paolo. "Where, I wonder, will they go next? Why, surely, senor, this road does not lead to the bridge yonder. We are not going to pick our way in the air, too? The roar of those waters has made my head dizzy already, and the rocks here are as dark as midnight, and seem ready to tumble upon one. They are enough to make one despair to look at them. You need not have checked my mirth, senor."
"I would fain check your loquacity," replied Vivaldi. "Do, good Paolo, be silent and circumspect. Those people may be near us, though we do not yet see them."
"The road does lead to the bridge, then, senor," said Paolo dolorously. "And see, there they are again, winding round that rock and coming towards us."
"Hush, they are pilgrims," whispered Vivaldi. "We will linger under the shade of these rocks while they pass. Remember, Paolo, that a single indiscreet word may be fatal, and that if they hail us, I alone am to answer."
"You are obeyed, senor."
The fugitives drew up close under the cliffs, and proceeded slowly, while the words of the devotees, as they advanced, became audible.
"It gives some comfort," said Paolo, "to hear cheerful voices in such a place as this. Bless their merry hearts! There seems a pilgrimage of pleasure. But they will be demure enough, I warrant. By and by I wish I—"
"Paolo, have you so soon forgot?" said Vivaldi sharply. The devotees, on perceiving the travelers, became suddenly silent, till he who appeared to be the father director, as they passed, said,
"Hail, in the name of Our Lady of Mount Carmel!"
and they repeated the salutation in chorus. "Hail," replied Vivaldi. "The first mass is over," and he passed on.
But if you make haste, you may come in for the second, said Paolo, jogging after. You have just left the shrine, then, said one of the party, and can tell us? Poor pilgrims like yourselves, replied Paolo, and can tell as little. Good morrow, fathers, yonder peeps the dawn. He came up with his master, who had hurried forward with Elena, and who now severely reproved his indiscretion, while the voices of the Carmelites singing the matin hymn sunk away among the rocks, and the quietness of solitude returned. Thank heaven, we are quit of this adventure, said Vivaldi. And now we have only the bridge to get over, rejoined Paolo, and I hope we shall all be safe. They were now at the entrance of it. As they passed the trembling planks and looked up the glen, a party of people appeared advancing on the road the fugitives had left, and a chorus of other voices than those of the Carmelites were heard mingling with the hollow sound of the waters. Elena, again alarmed, hastened forward, and Vivaldi, though he endeavored to appease her apprehension of pursuit, encouraged her speed. These are nothing but more pilgrims, signor, said Paolo. Oh, they would not send such loud shouts before them. They must needs think we can hear. The travelers proceeded as fast as the broken road would permit, and were soon beyond the reach of the voices. But as Paolo turned to look whether the party was within sight, he perceived two persons wrapped in cloaks, advancing under the brow of the cliffs, and within a few paces of his horse's heels. Before he could give notice to his master, they were at his side. "Are you returning from the shrine of Our Lady?" said one of them. Vivaldi, startled by the voice, looked round and demanded who asked the question. "A brother pilgrim," replied the man, "one who has toiled up these steep rocks till his limbs will scarcely bear him further. Would that you would take compassion on him and give him a ride." However compassionate Vivaldi might be to the sufferings of others, this was not a moment when he would indulge his disposition without endangering the safety of Elena, and he had even fancied the stranger spoke in a voice of dissimulation. His suspicions strengthened when the traveler, not repulsed by a refusal, inquired the way he was going, and proposed to join his party. "For these mountains, they say, are infested with banditti," he added, "and a large company is less likely to be attacked than a small one." "If you are so very weary, my friend," said Vivaldi, "how is it possible you can keep pace with our horses, though I acknowledge you have done wonders in overtaking them?" "The fear of these banditti," replied the stranger, "urged us on." "You have nothing to apprehend from robbers," said Vivaldi, "if you will only moderate your pace, for a large company of pilgrims are on the road who will soon overtake you." He then put an end to the conversation by clapping spurs to his horse, and the strangers were soon left far behind. The inconsistency of their complaints with their ability, and the whole of their manner, were serious subjects of alarm to the fugitives. But when they had lost sight of them, they lost also their apprehensions, and having at length emerged from the pass, they quitted the high roads of Naples and struck into the solitary one that led westward towards Aquila. End of Chapter 12. Reading by Marty Chris.